So today we're going to have a talk on decision-making and evacuation behavior by Dr. Max Kinateder, who is at an RCC in Canada. And I just want to remind you that this webinar series is part of the Human Behaviour in Fires panel group of the IAFSS, which is coordinated by myself, Enrico Ronchi, and I'm an associate professor at Lund University here in Sweden. And together with me, there is Erika Kuligowski from RMIT in Australia, which due to time zone, she could not be here live. And we are at the 12th event of our webinar series. So it's proceeding very well. We had a very wide range of different speakers with different research interests and expertise, all linked to human behavior in fires. But we also have a set of ongoing activities in the human behavior in fire domain. We recently published a couple of papers linked to our work aiming at mapping the human behavior in fire field and also towards building a research agenda for the field. So if you're interested in what you're doing and if you have not done it yet, you can join our Human Behaviour in Fire permanent group of IAFSS. It is free, and you can do it just to remain updated, or if you are interested in contributing to any of our activities, you're welcome to show your interest in this. So Arthur, who is a Ph.D. student of mine that helps me with the logistics of this webinar series, has just posted in the chat the link to sign up for our mailing list. I also want to remember that we have a YouTube channel where all these webinars are posted after being recorded, so you can also sign up for our YouTube channel. And thanks, Arthur, for posting this in the chat as well. So all the recordings are there of the previous 11 webinars, and also there will be the one that we hear today from our speaker. So we have today Max Kinateder, and Dr. Kinateder is a research officer at the National Research Council Canada and an adjunct faculty in cognitive science at Carleton University. He's a behavioral scientist interested in human behavior in emergency situations. Most of his research is about questions on why and how people act in emergency situations, such as building fires or wildfires. This includes questions of what determines if and when people decide to evacuate and how people find their way to safety. So the research questions are like, what are the underlying psychological mechanisms of evacuation decision-making? What can we do to prepare building occupants and communities to evacuate efficiently when necessary? How can we design our built environment to afford safe egress to all? So Max, also a Ph.D. in psychology from the University of Wuerzburg in Germany. And it's my great pleasure to have him here as a speaker. We have been for a very short time also colleagues back in the days. He both visited Lund and I was visiting in Wuerzburg. So I'm going to now just put up his slides. Just a second. And Max, please, of course, when you want me to go to the next slide, just let me know. So,
yeah, I will let you know. And just to let you know, there are some videos and animations in the presentation. So if they don't work well, I think this. I think I just keep talking, and I just tell you to click next. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties. Yeah, I can just take it from here if you guys are ready.
Yes, please go ahead, Max.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me today. I want to begin with acknowledging that the NRC has offices across Canada, which are located on unceded, shared, current, and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. So the NRC headquarters in Ottawa, which is where I live and work, is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We recognize our privilege to be able to conduct research on these lands, and we pay respect to the peoples who were here long before us. So today I'm going to talk to you about decision-making and evacuation behavior. And people, as you may know, are not optimal decision makers. We are bounded by the situations that we're in, the information that's available to us, our individual personality traits, as well as our psychological states. So unfortunately, in emergencies, information is often incomplete and that requires people to make decisions under uncertainty and sometimes even under time pressure. So hopefully this presentation will give you an overview on how people navigate the environments in emergencies and how decisions are being made and can be biased by factors that are in the environment and also within individuals. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just the agenda for the presentation. I'll start with talking about the decision-making in general and in emergencies. We'll try to tie it to the evacuation timeline, and then talk about how factors such as social influence and fear can influence decision-making in the pre-travel and the travel phase of the evacuation timeline. And then finally, I'll spend some time on how this can be implemented in evacuation models. Next slide, please. So when we think of human behavior in fire, we typically assume that there are three factors influencing the outcome of a fire incident in a building. So there's the fire itself, the smoke, flames, and the associated conditions. So think of heat, toxic fumes, etc. Then we have the building. So this is, for example, the type of occupancy. Is this a residential building? Is it a commercial building? What are the number of floors? What are the available egress routes, etc. And finally, we have the people who are in the building. So what are their mobility profiles? How old are they? Are they familiar with the place? So questions like that. Next slide, please. So in an emergencies, occupants need to make a number of decisions that can be roughly broken down into two questions. So first of one is whether or not to evacuate. Should I stay? Should I go? And the next one, if one has decided to evacuate, is what do I need to do to get a safer place to? So this is sort of an optimization question. On the next slide, it's probably worth to briefly talk about how we make decisions in general. So the probably best known model of human decision-making and information processing is the so-called dual process theory, introduced by Danny Kahneman a few years ago, I think just over 20 years ago, actually. This model is not without criticism, I have to say, but it's very popular and extremely useful for our purposes. And if you're interested in accessible reading recommendation, Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a really good introduction. At the core, this theory postulates that there are two systems of human information processing. So we have something called system one and something called system two. System one is an automatic system that is fast, efficient, but the price for that is that it's not controllable. So it's not accessible to conscious processes. It's unintentional. So here we think about emotions, impulses, habits, beliefs, etc. So for the example of this would be, for example, when I was making my morning cup of coffee just a few minutes ago, I didn't really think about the specific details on how to make the cup of coffee. I just ran through the motions, even though I made some decisions in there. And this is a really great system because it frees up resources for system two, which is more deliberate. So it's slow, but deliberate means slower, less efficient, but it's available to consciousness and it's more controllable. So here we think about sort of like a logical system. That is where we reflect, where we plan, where we think about problem solving. So think about if you're planning a road trip and have to travel somewhere that you've never been before. So you clearly have to sort of think about each individual steps, and people can do that. However, it is important to understand that neither system one or system two are perfect or even guarantee a correct answer. Humans are by and large not rational decision makers, right? And in fact, both systems can be subject to what we call cognitive biases. Next slide, please. So cognitive biases are systematic patterns of deviation from rationality in judgment and decision-making. So where people are influenced by their prior experience, for example, their emotions, and by using inherent mental shortcuts. So these mental shortcuts are something called heuristics. And we develop them by creating associations between a given situation and our past experience. So for example, an experienced fire incident commander can rely on their experience to make quick and relevant decisions during a fire incident and under time pressure. So heuristics are really, really helpful when really helpful, particularly when we don't have all the information available. We just go with our best guess, and oftentimes that's the right thing to do. However, most people have little experience with navigating emergencies, and unfortunately, in those situations, information is also often incomplete. And this then creates scenarios in which the use of heuristics can lead to biases in decision-making. There's an infinite ways in which decision-making can be biased, but researchers have sort of created a typology of common cognitive biases that's shown on the right here. If those slides are being shared, I think there's a link to it, but this is really just from the Wikipedia page. But just to give you a few examples. So there's something called anchoring, which refers to the tendency to rely heavily on a single piece of information. Or there's something called the availability bias, describing that we tend to have a tendency to focus on easily accessible information. There's something called the normalcy bias, which is the tendency to interpret incoming information as a confirmation of the status quo. So for example, if you hear a fire alarm, most likely this is a false alarm or a drill. So you may be biased to think, oh, this is not an emergency, right? There's also something called optimism bias, which refers to a tendency to underestimate personal risk. So the usual example that people use here are smokers who are very aware that smoking in general is not good for you. But when you ask, when you ask a smoker what is your personal risk of, say, developing lung cancer, they may underestimate their own individual risk. So this list is really not exhaustive, but I hope it carries across the point that people can be biased systematically when they're making decisions. Next slide, please. So how does this all fit with how we study evacuations? So a common and really useful way to describe evacuations is this timeline model. It defines 3 distinct phases as well, the events that can happen in them. So we have something called the pre-alarm phase, which is the time between the beginning of an incident until an alarm is triggered. The pre-travel phase, which is also sometimes referred to as the pre-evacuation phase, which includes the time between when the alarm is being triggered and the beginning of egress movement. And then finally we have something called the travel period, which is essentially describing egress movement until a person reaches a place of safety. Next slide, please. So now that we have this timeline model established, we also need to understand how we can study decision-making in emergencies. So one thing that is really important to acknowledge is that there's no one perfect method. So the key for researchers in this area is often to select an optimal way to answer a question, particularly when you do it empirically. And all the empirical methods that we have available need to find a balance between what we call experimental control and ecological validity. Okay. And so, for example, if we look at hit for the next thing, yeah, perfect. So, for example, if we take a look at data from real-world events, we can assume really high ecological validity because it's the real thing. However, it can be hard to transfer findings from one case study or from one context to another, and we, as observers, have no control over the events that we are observing, and that can make causal inference really challenging. In the lab, however, we are able to closely control the environment, which gives us the opportunity to look into like fine-grained details of decision-making and to test specific hypotheses. However, as we all know, data collection in the lab could be too artificial, and for example, the simulated conditions may not be realistic enough. So what I will try to do through the remainder of this presentation is to introduce case studies from real-world incidents that reveal, for example, a behavioral phenomenon and that can occur during an evacuation. And then I will present controlled experiments that study these phenomena in more detail. Next slide, please. I'll start with the example of the evacuation from the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. So I assume that everyone here is at least somewhat familiar with this incident. But on that day, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks were carried out, and 2 planes were flown into 2 towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, which ultimately caused these 2 towers to collapse. There has been a lot of research done on the World Trade Center incident itself and also on the evacuation. Next slide, please. So, for example, researchers were able to reconstruct the evacuation process from those 2 towers based on interviews with hundreds of survivors. Next slide, please. So we know, for example, that World Trade Center 101 was hit at 8:46. Maybe Enrico just click through those so the timeline to appear exactly. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, perfect. So World Trade Center was hit at 8:46 in the morning, which was also the average time for occupants to become aware that there was an incident. On average, it took them about 5 to 6 minutes to make the decision to evacuate and then begin evacuation. And on average, occupants reached the street level around 40 minutes after they started egress, and World Trade Center 1 collapsed at 10:28. Next slide, please. So in the previous slide, I mentioned the word average a fair bit. So what's really interesting to do is, just hit on the next slide, please, that these average times can sometimes be a little bit misleading. So what's interesting is that there's a huge variation in how long occupants, for example, needed to decide to evacuate, which range from between 1 minute to almost 45 minutes. And if you look at the sort of like the travel phase of this, you can see an even larger range, which can be attributed at least partially to the distance that people had to walk. But I want to zoom in a little bit more on the evacuation decision. So as mentioned, you can see that some occupants needed up to 45 minutes to decide when to evacuate. So on the next few slides, I will talk about some of the factors that might have led to these seemingly long times. Next slide, please. So just to remind you this, so we're in the pre-travel period, that we have evacuation decision, the evacuation decision at the center of this phase. Just move on to the next slide, please. And the next one. Thanks, Enrico. So there's a very useful theoretical model called the protective action decision model. Should be brief as PIDM. And this model postulates that occupants need to answer 5 questions to engage in what is called protective actions in disasters. But protective actions could be something like deciding to evacuate. So the first decision that they need to make is called risk identification. Is there a threat that I need to pay attention? And then you need to do a risk assessment where you personalize that risk. So is there something that is there a threat that is relevant to me? Once you've identified a threat, you move on to first searching the possible protective actions that are out there, which is the protective action search, which you could come up with a list of potential activities. And then you need to assess those potential behavioral options by selecting the one that's best for you, right? And this may vary who you are, for example. And once you've identified the protective action, you need to answer the question, do I need to take this action now? And then move on. Next slide, please. So so these questions are part of a larger theoretical model, which begins with changes with cues. So the cues are changes in the physical or social environment. So think of a fire alarm going off, or seeing smoke, or seeing other people evacuate. These cues need to be perceived, paid attention to, and understood. And here, individual differences are really important. So, for example, someone who's hard of hearing may not hear a fire alarm. Someone who has a visual impairment might not see the same cues as someone who has quote unquote normal vision, right? But once those cues are perceived, paid attention to, and understood, the idea in PIDM is that the person then goes through these 5 questions that I mentioned in the previous slide, and they either resume their previous activities, click, and if there's no threat detected, or then engage into protective actions, and click. So one thing that's critical in PIDM is that it assumes that what has assumptions about what people do when there's uncertainty. So in this model, the model postulates that whenever there is uncertainty, people will look for more information. Next slide. So let's just circle back to the World Trade Center evacuation. What were people doing in the pre-evacuation phase? Turns out lots of different things, but most commonly in this type of occupancy, these could be classified as information seeking or preparing. I'm not going to go through the details here, but the study that I'm citing here looked into the pre-evacuation actions of those occupants. And most commonly, people were either talking to each other, gathering items, or helping each other. Note that this might be very different today, more than 20 years after this incident. So some of those activities that were observed then probably are different now. So for example, I don't think we may shut down our computers anymore or finish phone calls on the landline. This would also look radically different in other occupancies. So in a residential occupancy, for example, some people might be asleep, or in hospitals, people might require more assistance. Next slide, please. So going back to this understanding of cues and that cues needs to be perceived and understood. So most occupants reported that they perceived the building moving from the impact. But many occupants did not know what had happened and only realized that the magnitude of the event until they had reached the tower lobby of the outside. In World Trade Center 2, there was adjacent that some occupants had access to visual cues, for example, seeing debris falling down. So the type of cue and the ambiguity of a cue really depended on the location within the tower. Next slide, please. And to support PADM here is that even in the most intense situations, people will seek information. So the majority in both towers began milling immediately after World Trade Center 1 was hit, because many were interested in finding out what was going on or whether something was going on at all. So while others were convinced that they knew what was taking place, but were uncertain what to do. Next slide, please. When occupants were asked for the reasons for them to begin evacuation, several common themes emerged. So I wanted to highlight that these that, for example, there's the sense of being in danger and the behavior of other people that seem to have played an important role. So some people evacuated because they were told to do so, or they saw others evacuating. So in the next few slides, I want to talk about research that looked into how these two factors, social influence and fear, can shape evacuation decision-making. Next slide, please. So moving on to social influence. So people influence each other in emergency situations. A good example of this is the so-called bystander effect, where individuals are less likely to respond to an emergency or help if passive bystanders are around. The study that first introduced this effect was work by Darlene Latané in the late 1960s and early 70s, where they invited participants into a room and they were working on some kind of bogus task as a group, and then they had smoke enter the room. Critically, there was really one actual participant, and everyone else were actors. And all those actors just simply ignored the smoke. And what they observed is that the naive participants sometimes waited up to 20 minutes to notify the experimenter about the incident. Next slide, please. We wanted to study this more systematically and also want to see if we could replicate this in our lab and also see if we can test this in virtual reality. So we invited participants to work on a task, on a some kind of bogus perceptual task in our lab, once in a real-world environment, and once in a matched virtual environment. So if you click one more, Enrico, you should be seeing in a video exactly. So here you can see our participant working on the bogus task. About 5 minutes in, a fire alarm was being triggered, and you can see that the participant is walking on. So on the far right, you can see the first-person view in virtual reality. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the critical manipulation here is the presence and behavior of a bystander. The video that you saw was the control condition, right? So participants are alone. But we had two conditions where we had a bystander next to our participant who also worked on the same task. In the active condition, this bystander would startle when the fire alarm was triggered and then immediately leave the room. In the passive condition, the bystander startled and then looked around and then went back to the task and essentially ignored the fire alarm. In the real world, this was an actor who pretended to be another participant. And in VR, this was an animated virtual human that you can see in the picture here. And we told our participants, so this is a recording of the previous participant. And we will also record your behavior for the next participant. And then we simply analyzed how many of our participants decided to evacuate. Next slide, please. So on the, this is great. Yeah. So on the y-axis, we show the percent of participants who decided to evacuate. Let's take a look at the real world data first. So what you can see here is the classic bystander effect. Our participants in the active conditions were more likely to evacuate compared to both other conditions. There were only 2 participants in the passive conditions who evacuated. So one of them, I will never forget this, really just looked at our bystander and yelled at them, "Yo, this is a fire alarm," and then ran out. In VR, we see something slightly different. The first thing that we observe is that fewer participants evacuated, but the bystander still had the same effect or similar comparable effect compared to the real world. So participants were still more likely to evacuate in the active condition compared to the other 2 conditions. However, the effect that the bystander had was also weaker than the one of the real world bystander. So this dampening effect is somewhat expected, since the alarm was totally unexpected in the real environment. It was actually, after all, a real fire alarm. Whereas in VR, that anything that happens is clear to participants that it's part of the experiment, since it's happening in virtual reality. But what this study shows, I think, is that it establishes that how like more systematically how the bystander effect might work, but also that we can use virtual reality as a tool to study evacuation decision. Next slide, please. So let's move on to the travel period. So just as a reminder, so this is the time between the beginning of egress until an evacuation has been completed. And in this period, people are moving. So there's a lot of research that's looked into how people on route choice, for example, so how people find their way to safety. Next slide, please. Here I want to use the example of the Summerland fire on the Isle of Man from in 1973. This was a real tragic event that occurred on the evening of August 2nd, 1973. So Summerland was a large leisure complex on the Isle of Man in the UK, where a small fire that started on the outside of the main building quickly spread to the building. And I believe due to the highly combustible construction materials, the fire then escalated rapidly, engulfing the entire structure. So 50 people lost their lives in this incident and many more were injured. And this then highlighted the significant shortcomings of building safety standards and emergency response protocols at the time. Jonathan Syme was an influential psychologist who studied this event and who studied evacuation behavior in general. And he developed this model that's called the affiliative model, which postulates that people will egress via familiar routes and move the people that they know in emergencies. So for the sake of this presentation, I will focus on his findings from one particular place or one particular bar in the Summerland building complex. And what Jonathan Syme did is that he was able to establish that whether or not people move to the familiar or with familiar people based on like reports that he analyzed. Click. So, for example, a staff member who were at the who were mostly located behind the bar were more likely to use the fire exit, which also happened to be the same door that they used to enter their building to begin their work. Click. Patrons, however, were influenced by other factors. So, for example, some would go to the nearest exit, while others followed guidance from others and moved with people, which they knew. One more click. Yeah, and this is illustrated here with people who move in groups. Next slide. Yeah, so when we wanted to study this is more systematically, like taking it from a case study into an controlled experiment. So in this study, we wanted to also disentangle the effects of social influence and movement to the familiar. So here we had if you click one more time, Enrico. So in this study, participants were entering a room that looked a little bit like a museum, and critically, this room had two doors. And when we triggered a fire alarm, our participants could choose between those two doors. And one was, because they used it to enter the room, is our familiar door, and then the other one is our unfamiliar door. In addition, we manipulated the presence and the behavior of a bystander. Participants would either be alone, this is the control condition, or a virtual human would be present who either would ignore the fire alarm, quite similar to the previous study, or would choose the familiar or the unfamiliar exit. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are the main results. So on the y-axis, we plot the percentage of participants who move to the familiar. On the far left, you see the control condition. So this establishes the familiarity effect, right? So participants were more likely to choose the familiar exit over the unfamiliar. But what's interesting, if you look at the social influence, in particular in the unfamiliar and familiar conditions, so these are the conditions where the bystander moved either to the familiar or the unfamiliar door, you could see how that the behavior of the bystander modulated the movement to the familiar of our participants. In the familiar condition, virtually none of our participants chose the unfamiliar exit, whereas in the unfamiliar condition, participants were evenly split between the familiar and the unfamiliar door. Yeah, so next slide, I think. Just skip that one. So now that we've looked at how one person can influence exit choice, let's also take a look at the influence that multiple people have, so the impact of larger groups or crowds, if you will. There's a very useful theoretical framework about crowd movement that describes how the local interactions between individuals in a crowd then lead to global patterns of motion. It's called the behavioral dynamics framework. The question that we wanted to ask in this study is like, how does the number of people around us influence where we go? So what happens if one part of a crowd, for example, goes to one exit and the other goes to a different exit? And does it matter? It doesn't matter if it's a larger crowd or a smaller crowd. So here we wanted to disentangle the effects of absolute number of people that influence you and the proportion of people going to it. So if you click next once more, Enrico, you can see an example trial here. This is an example where like half of the crowd went to the left door and the other half went to the right door. And yeah, we had two different crowd sizes. One, the smaller crowd had 10 agents and the larger crowd had 20 people. And then the proportion of agents was going to one or to the other was manipulated from 0 to 110% increments. Next slide. Yeah, so here you can see the results. So let's take a look at the smaller crowd first. So this is so on the y-axis you can see the proportion of participants following the majority of the crowd. We collapsed it over left and right door because we didn't see any particular bias going to the other. But so the blue line is the smaller crowd. What you can see here is that initially our participants were kind of like choosing at random between left and right door, but at a certain point we saw this roughly monotonic increase as the crowd exit choice became more uniform. In the larger crowd, we see a slightly different pattern. So initially our participants chose randomly between left and right, so there was no difference between to the other conditions, but then our participants tended to avoid the more crowded exit and only have a clear majority when all of the virtual agents chose one particular door. They started following the majority here. So what this shows is that the effects of group behavior and occupants changes as a function of group size. Next slide, please. So in addition to route choice, we also were interested in travel paths. And we're interested in see if travel paths can also be changed or influenced by social influence. Even without the presence of social influence, humans rarely move in a straight line from A to B. So this has, for example, been shown in tunnel evacuations, where occupants tend to move along the wall of a tunnel in general. And so to study this, we asked participants to evacuate from a simulated road tunnel fire, where half of the participants were alone and the other half saw a person running to the nearest exit. So it's kind of, if you focus on the top center of the slide, you can see the starting positions, and then participants had to move to that emergency exit. It's like the small green dot here, moving from right. Oh yeah, thank you for this, Enrico. Yeah, actually, Enrico and I worked on this study. That's a fun time. So in the control group, taking a look at the results at the bottom. So the control, but this is a heat map that shows where participants were in the two conditions. So blue areas show you where we found more participants in the control group. Red areas show you where more participants from the social influence group. So in the control group, we saw that what was expected. So participants tended to move along the tunnel wall to the exit. And in the other group, however, participants were more likely to follow the path of the virtual human. So this study shows that the behavior of others doesn't only influence exit choice, but also travel paths. Next slide, please. So let me just circle back to the initial case study. I hope that you saw that social influence can impact evacuation decision making. However, what we saw from the World Trade Center, it was also clear that fear and perceived danger were influenced decision making, right? So I want to take a few minutes to talk about how stress and fear could influence decision making in emergencies. However, and this is quite critical, as you will see, there's far less information on this issue available than on social influence. Next slide, please. But before I do that, I need to talk about panic. And can you just click one more? I will not talk about this in detail because there has been a really, really good webinar in this exact same series. So I don't want to talk about it too much, but I hope that you all see that presentation because it was really fantastic. But why is that? Just to reiterate, why is the term panic problematic in thinking of it? So first of all, we don't really know what panic really is in an emergency context. It's both the assessment and the definition of this is not really straightforward. In addition, so quote unquote panic is really rare in emergencies, so in disasters. So for example, during the World Trade Center evacuation, the quote unquote classic panic actions for example, of people behaving in an irrational manner was only noted in less than 1% of cases. This was a study by Blake Galea and Galea. The term itself is ambiguous and not clearly defined in the context of safety. It's more commonly used in the media, in the lay descriptions of behavioral responses of emergencies. And it's maybe inappropriate because most pro-social and supportive behavior is really widespread in disasters. So people are, this is also a very good quote that I like, is that disasters often brings out the best in people, right? And finally, I think the term panic may falsely lay the responsibility of the outcome of an event on the individuals who are part of the event, and whereas the root cause may be something different. However, I suspect, and this is really my speculation here, is that the discussion around this term had the effect that the impact of stress and fear have not really been studied in as much detail as other aspects of the evacuation decision. Next slide, please. So, for example, we know that fear can influence how people move around. This is a study that showed how people with agoraphobia tend to avoid open spaces. So agoraphobia is an anxiety disorder that causes intense fear or becoming overwhelmed or unable to escape or get help. And because of that, people who suffer from agoraphobia often avoid new places and unfamiliar situations. So in this study, the authors asked participants to walk to a goal through a town, and their path led them across a town square, or the market square, actually. And what they saw, they tested two groups of participants. One was a control group. These were quote-unquote healthy research participants, and then they had a group of patients who suffer from agoraphobia. And what they saw was that, and you can kind of see this in the trajectories here, is that the control group tended to walk straight across the market square, whereas those who are the agoraphobic patients tended to stick to the side of the market square and avoided the open. So we can clearly see how fear can affect pedestrian behavior, right? Next slide, please. So, but what is fear, right? So fear is a reaction to a specific threat, though. It's a natural emotion and that protects us from harm in face of real or imminent danger. So this is a really useful mechanism to motivate protective actions. However, we also know, and this is kind of circling back to the initial part of this presentation, that fear can also introduce biases in decision-making. So for example, Paul Slovic, as a renowned researcher on perceived risk, noted that negative emotions such as fear or fear of things like nuclear power tend to result in greater assessment of perceived risk and lower assessments of the perceived benefits of the technologies like that. Fear can also lead to an overestimation of risk for infrequent but catastrophic outcomes. The classic example here is that some people may be afraid of flying and then to avoid flying and engage in the greater objective risks of driving long distances with their own partners. Sunstein has introduced the term probability neglect to describe how we tend to overestimate the chances of such worst-case scenarios, with evidence that that we sometimes do so to the point that our own protective responses cause more harm than good, actually. Next slide, please. So the idea that perceived risk and stress impact evacuation decision-making is not. In fact, some researchers have even introduced a computational model that explicitly ties decision-making to perceived risk, which is shown here on the right. So the core idea of this model is that environmental and social cues can change the level of perceived risk, which in turn is then tied to behaviors and actions. Next slide, please. And yeah, so yes, so let me just summarize the main points of what I've talked so far. So I hope I've shown you evidence from both field observations and control studies that showed that how social influence and perceived risk can influence decision-making in the pre-travel and the travel period. Click. So, for example, we saw some research about the bystander effect. This is an example of how social influence can delay the decision to evacuate. Okay. We also saw that social influence can impact travel paths during evacuation. Click. And we also saw some evidence how fear can affect travel paths. And finally, last click. We saw how these factors can be taken into consideration in evacuation simulating tools. So one reason why this timeline model is so useful is because it permits us to simulate evacuation behavior with these tools that I mentioned before. Because they can be implemented in agent-based models, right? This is critical, for example, in performance-based design, where one can use this timeline to evaluate whether or not it is feasible to complete evacuation of a building before the conditions inside become untenable. So this is often referred to, for example, as the ASET-RSET evaluation, where ASET is the available safe egress time and RSET the required safe egress time. Next slide. But before I leave, I want to make one last point, and that is that we as scientists and people who study human behavior in fire can also be biased. For example, a while ago, we surveyed users of evacuation models. So these are people who can be considered as experts in human behavior in fire. And we asked them, for example, how do you select the computational model of your choice, your simulation tool? And most of our respondents stated that they would choose the model that they were familiar with. And when we later asked them how many models are you familiar with, most of them said one or two models. Another reason that was given was that why a model was chosen was because it was just readily available. So that means that the decision made was not really a decision, and it was definitely not explicitly based on what the most suitable model was for the task. So this could be something like considered as the availability bias that we briefly talked about in the introduction. When setting up the models, we're also able to sort of document certain biases. So, for example, more than a third of our respondents stated that they would use the default walking speeds most of the time. And when we asked them if they were aware of the source for the default walking speeds, over a third, almost 40%, stated that they did not know that. So that means that there's a risk that users select blindly, if you will, default values without checking the validity of the underlying assumptions. Right? So this could be something called the default bias. Of course, this doesn't mean that we should question the use of evacuation models. They're really powerful tools. It simply means that the users of evacuation models are also humans, and they can be biased too. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Max, for your very interesting presentation. Yes, I managed to restart my screen. So, as usual, during this webinar series, we have the opportunity to have this last 15 minutes of our webinars for some questions. I will kindly ask you to write them in the chat, and I will read them through. And after we finish the one in the chat, if we still have time, we can have more live questions. There is a first comment from Brian Klein. I start with the first one. So traditionally, modelers represent pre-movement time as a log normal distribution. In your opinion, is still a fair or valid assumption? And if so, are there any updates? What factors in the real world influence the parameters for the distribution type? Max.
This is a very good question. And so I will give you the cop-out answer to that one because I don't really know the precise answer, and this may change over time. But it's very important to be aware of this the potential changes in response times as demographics change. So we have these changes, for example, that our societies are getting older and older. So these might change pre-evacuation curves for certain occupancies, right? As more people are aging in place, for example. The critical thing for a user of an evacuation model would be to test these assumptions and to identify, to do sort of like do the legwork and to check whether there's an updated body of knowledge to test these assumptions. That would be my response. I know it's the lazy response, but that's the best I can do in this one.
Thanks, Max. And if I can chip in, I mean, originally there are some earlier studies from Dave Purser which looked into social influence. I mean, I'm sure you're very aware of those and why we use log normal distribution. But indeed, it's a very good question to see if we need to update those distribution with more recent data sets. There is a second comment from Brian. Given the case with more than one door with an equal distance to the occupant starting position, thus following the majority take priority over leaving the room more quickly through a door with a smaller queue and faster flow rate. This is the infinite dilemma on exit choice. I think myself alone, I probably reviewed 50 different papers on exit choice. Some of it are from you, Max. So maybe you can comment on this.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, right? Because like it's essentially about like if you like what's the weight of those individual factors, right? And the tricky thing is, so in our own research, we try to tease these apart very systematically. But the downside of that is that we then, like often compare only a few cases, right? And without doing a sort of like, if you will, a sensitivity analysis of these individual factors. It was really interesting to see. So here where case studies can become quite interesting. So if you read, for example, the paper from Jonathan Syme about the Summerland incident. So they built a very nice model that where like with the tide, they compartmentalized the space and could show like depending on where you were, what people were more influenced by, right? With all the limitations of this particular study in taking into mind. So yes, so this could be quite interesting to study. There's also something that could be probably studied in a modeling study quite easily, assuming that the model assumptions are valid.
There is one more question in the chat. Can culture have an impact on egress by Ajaz Sharma?
Yeah, I find this a very interesting topic. The question is what does culture mean, right? And I think this is here it's quite important to be aware of what. So if you do say a comparison study between two countries. So, for example, there were studies, I forget who the authors were, but it was also who studied evacuation from university libraries across several countries, if I remember correctly. So the question then really is, so like, what of those differences that they observe are tied to sort of like the fact that people are a different nationality, but maybe also, like, what's the difference between a visitor to a library in a different? Maybe there are other differences between visitors in a library. That's the case, but then there are also sort of like social norms that can vary across societies that can influence how people use space in general, right? And yes, those can definitely influence the decision making because the social roles that we have in our societies can influence how people make decisions. So think of the people that we assign authority to and that we turn to when there's uncertainty, and that can definitely vary across countries. But the term cultural difference I think is a bit of a too broad of a term. You always have to drill down in the specifics, in my opinion.
Thanks. I can see Jake wants to make some comments. Please, Jake, go ahead. Just please keep an eye on the time because we want to also give an answer to the last two questions, but it would be very nice to get some historical perspective from you. We are very happy to have you in our webinar series. And it's also very good that Max is the speaker because it's at NRC. So.
Yeah, I'm holding up my most prized photograph of Galen Prue and Jonathan Syme. Omid Piscini is on the third person there. Two of those, at least two or three, or maybe three, are already deceased. It's interesting that there are many parts of what you presented today that sort of repeat, like the whole issue of panic. And incidentally, my work dates back to I started at NRC as the first person in a stream of people, of which you're the fifth person, by the way. I can name the other ones if you want. But it's interesting how panic, we keep after preaching what I was using as a prime reference from a book in 1962, Man and Society and Disaster, which was a sociological perspective in natural disasters. It was the only reference, by the way, that the library at the University of British Columbia could provide me in doing my graduation project on responses to emergencies in buildings. And I don't have a copy of the book, but it's still available. You can find it online. It's a good read, by the way, because it's a book of readings by several people. And I heartily recommend that we in the fire and the human behavior look at our roots and learn from them. I was very fortunate having access to a whole bunch of experts in my career, 20 years of which was at NRC. And by the way, I was followed by Brian Jones, Ghislaine Prue, Steve Gwynn, and now Max. So that covers 57 years of history.
The footsteps are really, really big.
Yeah. And there were some really good people there. And Max, I'm looking forward to some long chats with you as well. So I just thought I'd give that perspective. I have to give my own talk later on this week on an international hookup like we have here today, but it's a one-day event out of John Jay College. So if anyone's interested in being involved, it's free. And its focus will be high-rise buildings, but some people who are on this meeting today may be interested, and so they can get in touch with me. My email address is buildinguse@aol.com, BLDGUSE@aol.com. So I'd be happy to pass on information on that. And I was very happy, Max, to find or to see not the last in the stream, but the current one in the stream of people at the National Innocence Council of Canada. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thanks for those comments, Jake. And I guess, I mean, we can talk. Yeah, these are big shoes to fill. So for just cycling back to the matter of panic, and I find this really interesting. So in the history of psychology, there was something called the cognitive turn. So there was like in the 1930s, I believe, psychologists were they tried to really study. They said there was this push against psychoanalytics, like this, it's the subconscious, because this produces non-falsifiable hypotheses. So you can't really study it scientifically. Then there was push. Okay, we can only study what we can measure. So people started studying this really sort of like very reductionist studies. So like classic conditioning studies, very interesting stuff, but it often neglected the things that are sort of like make humans humans, right? The complex emotional experiences that we have that shape behavior. And my feeling is that this pushback within our field on the topic of panic had this sort of like side effect that we, stay away from how decision making can be systematically biased and measurably biased by stress and fear, which are emotions that people experience in emergencies or can experience in emergencies. It's just a little bit understudied, I think, and I think it's because, like, the root cause of that is because we have to constantly swat this term panic out of the way, and there's nothing else that we can do about it.
Thanks, Max, and thanks, Jake, also for your historical perspective. I mean, this gives much more weight on our webinar series to have you here, and especially in this day that we have Max, so to have a bit of the history of NRCC, because I mean it's historically been a great contributor to research in our field. We have time for a couple of last questions that we have in the chat, and the next one is from Luigi. Has augmented reality already been tested in case of evacuation? Do you think there are more information to detect? Easy question for you, Max, because I know you wrote a review paper on this, right?
Yeah, so the answer is yes.
I think it would be nice to have in the chat the review paper, because
see if I can I will pull up the paper and put it in the chat afterwards. Yeah, so there's been some work. I mean, there's really great work also coming out of Massey University, Reno Lovregio. It's a really good source here. Yeah, so the problem with VR is it's just not realistic, right? Why is augmented reality a cool tool? Because you can place virtual content into the physical environment. So you sort of like have like a combination. So you have, and that really gives you good tools to, for example, test design options, right? You can think of signage, for example. You can place different design options into the real world and then test how people respond to them without having to build them physically first. So that's why I think AR is a really good tool here. I think there's the challenge with AR displays until recently was that they're so-called additive light displays. So that means they can't take things away. So it means that obscuring things with dark using black colors is very challenging, which makes simulating smoke and stuff like that quite problematic in AR. The other thing is that AR is quite sensitive to sort of like infrared light pollution that's coming in, so which kind of like limits how you can use it in different spaces. But in a controlled environment, this is quite useful for sure.
There is one comment from Anas, which joins Brian's first question. It's just more of a comment. Mentioned there as a practitioner, it makes sense to use a distribution as input when you're doing a more probabilistic approach, like with Monte Carlo. If not, deterministic inputs must be used. Is he asking if this is a good or wrong approach? What do you think, Max?
Yes. Using distributions and probabilistic approaches always more useful than using a fully deterministic approach, right? So it's like, particularly if you're using an evacuation model that uses probabilistic inputs and probabilistic outputs, then yes, you should not just run one simulation.
Yeah, and I mean, as the comment says, it makes sense though when you have the information, right, to put in, because there is a lot of use in the industry still of deterministic approach with the evacuation model, which is okay as long as the input to begin with is deterministic as well. That's the idea. There is one more question. Have you considered how an individual role in a group can change in an emergency, irrespective of the normal role in that group?
Yes, that's a very interesting point. I'm not aware of any research, but an example could be, for example, someone who has like training as a first responder is in a situation and has nothing to do with his training, but then the context changes and then the person can take on the role of a first responder. Yeah, absolutely. Social roles are very dynamic, and people like group behavior and things like that. These can change very quickly, and then very quickly. Yes, of course, this is something that can happen very easily.
Yes, and I think we ran out of questions. So I have one last $1 million question for you, Max. So if you will have, let's say, $1 million for research funding, in what topic related to evacuation and decision making will you put this money?
That's a very good question. So I'm a psychologist, so I'm interested in how people react and respond. But I think what would be really cool to do, like as a larger visual, is to like break down the silos and like figure out how we can use the insights from all those different disciplines to bring them together in one sort of like holistic explanatory theoretical model that explains human behavior and fire, and support that then supports tools that make our buildings and society safer.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for everyone then for your attendance to this very interesting webinar that we had today. So as usual, we look forward to having you at the next event of the webinar series. And also do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be kept updated on all our events and also on our mailing list so that you can know when we have the next event. And thanks again, Max. This was a fantastic presentation. We had a very nice Q&A as well. So thanks, everyone, and see you at the next event. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.